Good morning to the good people of St. Mark's, Harvey. I bring you greetings from around the diocese. This morning I want to talk with you about two of the scriptures that we had for today. The first one is 1 King, and the second reading that I want to talk about is the Gospel taken from Matthew. They're familiar to all of us. They are some of my favorite scriptures, and if you preach solely on one of them, you could preach for a long time. But today, we will shorten that a little bit and try to touch on some of the highlights of these two stories. The first one in 1 King has to do with Jezebel and Elijah. If you go back about a passage, a chapter before, what you see is Jezebel, who is a false prophet, has been killing the prophets of God. And Elijah has been carrying the torch for God and killing her prophets, Baal, and people who worship Baal. And the people of Israel, some of them had been worshiping Baal. But Jezebel sends word to Elijah that she is going to kill him, and Elijah is afraid for his life. And so Elijah takes off for the desert, and he ends up in where we pick up today. He ends up in a cave. And there he meets God. Let me read this to you. But he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness, and came and sat down under a solitary broom tree. He asked that he might die. Is it enough now, O Lord? Take my life, for I am no better than my ancestors. Then he lay down under the broom tree and fell asleep. Suddenly an angel touched him and said to him, Get up and eat. He looked, and there at his head was a cake baked on hot stones and a jar of water. He ate and drank and lay down again. The angel of the Lord came a second time, touched him and said, Get up and eat. Otherwise the journey will be too much for you. He got up and ate and drank. Then he went on the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the mount of God. At that place he came to a cave and spent the night there. Then the word of the Lord came to him, saying, What are you doing here, Elijah? He answered, I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. For the Israelites have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they are seeking my life to take it away. Elijah is scared all of a sudden. He has been carrying the torch. He's been doing the work that God has called him to do, but all of a sudden he is afraid for his life. And in a sense, he has forgotten who he is and whose he is. And he finds his way to a cave, a dark place. Many of us, when we find ourselves in this predicament, when we are afraid, there is darkness around us. And we try to hide, hoping that it will pass by. But as we continue to read, it doesn't. God recognizes the fear in him, and he says, Go out and stand on the mountain before the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by. And so Elijah goes to the entrance of the cave. Now there was a great wind, so strong that it was splitting mountains and breaking rocks in pieces before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a sound of sheer silence. I'm sure you've heard the term, it was so quiet, it was deafening. This is where Elijah finds himself. The sound was so powerful that he realized that God was in the midst, and so he takes his mantle, his cloak, and he puts it over his face, for he knows that God is in his presence now. And he asked Elijah again, Elijah, what are you doing here? It's interesting that God calls him by name. It is a familiar name. It's familiar for God to call you by your name, meaning that God knows you in a way that no one else knows you. God knows Elijah is afraid, but he has just simply forgotten who he is and whose he is. Elijah says, I am no better than my ancestors. I've been zealous for the Lord, but they are out to do me in. They're out to kill me. He thinks he's alone as well. He says, and I alone am left. But God says something to him interesting, that God says towards the end of the reading for today, go back, and these are the people I want you to anoint, to lead. And there are 7,000 Israelites waiting for you. It is a reminder to Elijah that he is not indeed alone, that there are 7,000 waiting for him to fight the battle for God. When we confront issues in our life, when we struggle with issues, when we don't know where to turn left or right, when we are in the midst of the pandemic, when we are protesting on the streets, sometimes that chaos keeps us from knowing who we are and keeps us from seeing who God is in our life. And we need to take a step back, to go to this place where there is sheer silence, as the writers say, so that we can hear what God is actually trying to say to us. And it is in that hearing and that listening that we are able to go and do the work that God has called us to do with assurance that God is with us. We see that in the gospel reading for today. And if you go back a couple of chapters earlier, you see where Jesus has just found out, he heard that his cousin John had been killed by Herod. Jesus wants to go to a quiet place. But on his way, he feeds several thousand people. But after that, he has compassion for them. And after that, he puts the disciples in a boat, and Jesus himself goes to a place of quiet and solitude where he can listen, where he can commune with God. It is in those moments that Jesus teaches us his own way of prayer, and our way of prayer is to follow, to get away from all of the chaos, to get away from the crowds, and get away from those who need us, so that we can have our own time of healing, of coming to know God in an intimate way, where the silence is so powerful that it's deadly. And we hear the voice of God sharing with us, healing us, so that we can do the work that God has called us to do. Jesus, in the middle of the night, we are told, begins to go see the disciples who are rowing against a very difficult wind. And Jesus walks on water, the scriptures say. And when he gets close to the boat, because he knows the disciples are struggling, Peter says, Lord, if it is you. It is the same words that are used against Jesus in the temptation of the wilderness. If it is you, throw yourself down. If it is you, if you are the King, if you are the Christ, do this and do that. Peter asks the same thing, Lord, if it is you, then command me to come out to you. And Jesus says, I think, with a kind of a wink, sure, come on. Peter does. He takes a step or two, and then he begins to go into the water. I think Peter falters because Peter is trying to be somebody that he was not called to be. Jesus walking on the water was not to demonstrate to anybody that he was the Christ. He simply was going to aid his brothers who were struggling against the wind and the waves. Peter had a motive so that he could walk on water, to be wowed. So maybe he could say to everyone else, look what I've done. Peter was not called to walk on the water. Peter was called to follow Jesus and to present the word of Jesus to the world. It's interesting that both Peter and Elijah stumbled a little bit, but God used them later on to lead and to be the people of God that he had called them to be. If I could take anything away from these two scriptures, it would be that God calls us to be who we are and not to be someone else, not to be afraid, but to listen and to find those moments in our life where we can surely hear the sheer silence of God in our prayer time, in our reading of scriptures, to do this daily, to find a place in our home where we can take with us all of the cares of the world and then put them in a context where God can heal, to teach, to give us hope, and give us direction. So as we continue to make our way, find those places in your home where you can hear the sheer silence, to move away from the chaos, and then listen. Listen to how God calls you to live in the midst of all of it, so that you may give hope to the hopeless, to the disenfranchised, so that you can be the person that God has called you to be. Amen.